Unplugged in, Russian opposition leader Alexey Navalny, imprisoned and unsure of his fate.
We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both.
After surviving a poisoning, the Putin critic is pushed further into Russia's prison system.
We imposed Russia sanctions on Alexey Navalny's poisoning and detention.
Beyond new sanctions, how might the new American president change the U.S. relationship with Moscow? Unplugged in, U.S. Russia, sanctions and policy. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren, reporting from Washington, D.C. Alexey Navalny says he's being held about 100 kilometers from Moscow in what he calls a real concentration camp. Russia's opposition leader was jailed in January after returning to Russia after an attempt to kill him by poison. Navalny was sentenced to prison for parole violations dating back a few years. Navalny's lawyer confirms his client was recently transferred to Penal Colony No. 2 in Russia's Vladimir region. Navalny's jailing sparked protests across Russia and generated demands from around the world for his release. In response to the jailing, the United States imposed new economic sanctions.
It's clear that Russian officials targeted Mr. Navalny for his activism and his efforts to reveal uncomfortable truths about Russian officials' corruption and to give voice to Russian citizens' legitimate grievances with their government and its policies. We are exercising our authorities to send a clear signal that Russia's use of chemical weapons and human rights abuses have severe consequences.
With its new leader now in prison, Russia's opposition movement faces an uncertain future with parliamentary elections. Those elections are scheduled for September. VOA's Charles Maynes tells us more from Moscow.
Vladimir Oblast, less than 100 kilometers from Moscow. The prison Alexey Navalny will call home for at least the next 2.5 years is said to be among Russia's most oppressive and brutal. And it's just one of many ways the government continues to apply pressure on the opposition figure and those seeking political change. Opposition candidates and municipal deputies gathered recently in Moscow to discuss strategies for competing in the country's fall elections, asking how to beat the odds and win local races against a Kremlin-backed political machine. They never got their answer. Police broke up the proceedings, arguing the event had ties to a foreign NGO the state deemed undesirable in 2017. With the entire conference placed under arrest, those who were there described it as an exercise in the absurd.
The events in our country of late are such that the writer Franz Kafka could only envy. He couldn't possibly have had enough imagination to make this up.
Fear has become the Kremlin's primary tactic as it tries to keep government opponents off the ballot and clearly off the streets. Thousands were detained during protests that followed Navalny's detention, with many kept in grim conditions and family members in the dark.
I couldn't get any information at all. You call and they tell you nothing. And now, only at midnight, did I find out he was at the prison here.
While others subsequently faced a more Soviet response to political dissent.
We were waiting for our court to take place. We were waiting inside the van, right beside the court. And there I read, I was fired from the institution where I used to work.
With the government promising further crackdowns, Navalny's allies called for a moratorium on street protests until the spring.
If we keep coming out every week, thousands more will be arrested and hundreds beaten.
They're pushing instead for more symbolic acts and rallying international pressure. The U.S. and European allies have both demanded Navalny's release, but also joined in imposing sanctions against high-ranking Russian officials, even if it's with the knowledge, say observers, that the measures change the Kremlin's calculus only so far.
They're not effective, and I'm not sure that there are any kind of sanctions that could influence what happens inside the country. I think the only purpose these sanctions serve is a kind of a signal to Kremlin that what happened is not unnoticed.
Yet Navalny's attacks on government corruption and his growing profile at home and abroad clearly has the Kremlin's attention as well. After years of treating him as politically irrelevant, the Kremlin now prefers the opposition figure out of the picture, whatever the cost. Charles Maynes for VOA News, Moscow.
I spoke to Charles Maynes for a sense of the political climate in Moscow and whether Navalny's jailing is affecting Vladimir Putin's grip on power. Can you tell me the political climate right now in Moscow and in Russia, if there's a way to describe it?
Well, I think it's clear that you've seen these very significant events over the last half year, starting with the poisoning of Alexey Navalny, his evacuation in a coma to Germany, his resurrection. He recovered and then made this kind of amazing return to Russia. I mean, these are big, big events unfolding. And, on the one hand, we saw, of course, people come out on the streets, but it didn't seem to kind of fundamentally change anything. I think there was an assumption from Navalny and his allies that this would put pressure and really, really transform the political situation here. What we've seen, though, is, of course, with these protests and against Mr. Navalny himself, repression. Fear seems to be the government's main tactic. We saw it in the way that they've sentenced Alexey Navalny to over 2.5 years in prison for these past alleged parole violations, while not investigating his poisoning. And at the same time, we've also seen, over 10,000, 11,000 people arrested over a series of protests in January and February. Just over this past weekend, I was at a pro-democracy forum where municipal candidates were gathering just to talk strategies for the fall elections here in Russia. That was met with police. They stormed the conference and arrested the entire conference. So repression seems to be the main factor here.
Has the jailing of Navalny had any impact on Putin's grip on power?
I think before the sense was that if they gave him a long-term prison sentence, that this would invite protests at home and also a lot of condemnation abroad. But now what we see is a moment where Russia is being condemned for other things already. So the idea of more sanctions on sanctions doesn't have quite as much of a bite. And Navalny himself it's also become very personal between Mr. Putin and Mr. Navalny. He released a video claiming corrupt practices by Mr. Putin, allegedly having this sort of incredible palace in the south of Russia along the Black Sea. There seems to be some truth to it. And although Mr. Putin, I should say, has denied the charges, but a good friend of his claimed to now own the property. But this has suddenly really kind of intruded into Mr. Putin's private circles. And I think that seems to have kind of personalized this conflict between these two men to the point where Putin is out to punish him.
Do you have any sense of what Navalny's followers would like to see the United States do or not do vis-a-vis Navalny?
They've made it quite clear they disagree with the United States for issuing what they call sectoral sanctions, so targeting the Russian economy. They see that essentially rallying Russians around Putin or the government per se. And so what they're suggesting is a list of what they call the financiers of Mr. Putin or some of his closest advisors or his friends and his cronies. And they think essentially that's the way to target the Russian government and not target the Russian people. Certainly what they've seen from the Biden administration at this point, they're hoping is just the beginning. We've seen essentially sanctions against 8 high-ranking Russian government officials, some concerns, some organizations as well that allegedly have ties to chemical weapons development, but not against the financiers, which seems to be a key issue for Navalny's allies.
What do you think is going to happen in the elections in September? Any thought?
If you go back to the poisoning this past August, Mr. Navalny was actually traveling in Siberia trying to rally people around this smart voting campaign that he and his team essentially had come up with. And the idea was to target the unpopularity of the ruling United Russia Party. And that's by pooling votes towards one candidate in particular. So they didn't care who they were, what their views were, but as long as they weren't affiliated with the Kremlin, they would target all the votes this way. And they ran this campaign in 2019 as kind of a test run. And it did have some effectiveness in some races, in some towns, not everywhere, but certainly in Moscow it did, and some towns in Siberia it did. And there was some sense that there's concern there that this could happen again. So it'll be interesting to see if they can keep that momentum going without sort of Mr. Navalny's charisma, use of social media, if people will stay kind of involved in the fight with essentially the leader of it behind bars.
A few days after Navalny's January arrest, his anti-corruption foundation released a video on social media. His foundation claims the video shows a billion-dollar palace built by friends of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has dismissed the claims, and they have not been independently verified. But the video of a lavish palace has generated hundreds of millions of views on YouTube, raising Navalny's profile in Russia. We have a report from our sister network, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
This is an artist's impression of a strip club in a secret palace for the enjoyment of Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to a new YouTube video with tens of millions of views.
This room is also equipped with a large stage and an extraordinary thing. The stage has an elevator with a pole. We can't imagine what a pole on a stage is for.
The video was made by opposition leader Alexey Navalny and posted by his supporters after he was jailed. He claims to have received leaked floor plans of the vast palace, which allegedly includes a casino, a theatre, extensive vineyards, an ice rink and luxury bathrooms, where even the Italian-made toilet brush costs $800. The many allegations in the almost 2-hour video could not be independently verified, and the Kremlin quickly dismissed them. But they are Navalny's latest salvo in an ongoing battle with Putin.
Putin's friends, having received from him the right to steal everything they want in Russia, have repaid him in many ways. But they also chipped in, collected $1.35 billion, and built a palace for their boss.
Navalny was detained on arrival at a Moscow airport on January the 17th, prompting a chorus of international criticism. He had just returned from Berlin, where he was being treated after being poisoned by a Novichok nerve agent in August last year. Investigations by Navalny's team, Bellingcat and other media presented extensive evidence that it was carried out by Russia's Federal Security Service. The Kremlin denies involvement, and pro-government media have been almost silent about all of this. But it appears to have raised Navalny's profile in Russia nonetheless.
The whole story of the poisoning drew the attention of a large number of people, and we have seen that the interest in his return has been pretty high. Of course, we can't say that the whole country has been glued to its screens to follow it, but there is pretty high interest, at least among the digital audience.
This is not the first time that the existence of the palace on the Black Sea coast has been reported. What's new in Navalny's report is the level of detail about the property and how it was allegedly financed with state funds stolen by Putin allies. But Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the video is just a rehash of old claims and noted that it includes an appeal for donations to Navalny's anti-corruption fund.
This is the real scam, and we warn all citizens, especially since the video has so many views. Think before transferring money to such crooks.
Navalny is being held in custody pending a hearing on whether he broke the terms of a suspended sentence relating to a previous conviction for embezzlement. Outside Russia, the conviction was widely seen as part of Kremlin efforts to silence Navalny, but he now faces up to 3.5 years in prison.
The Biden administration has declassified an intelligence report that shows in August of 2020, Russia's FSB intelligence agency plotted the poisoning of Alexey Navalny. Navalny survived the poisoning and identified the plotters. He did so with the help of Christo Grozev, a top researcher with Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an investigative journalism platform specializing in the use of open-source intelligence. I spoke to Grozev about how they tracked down the men who tried to kill Navalny by poisoning him.
We learned a lot of things. The first part of our discovery process led us to a team of poisoners working for the FSB, for a unit called the Criminalistics Institute of the FSB, that actually tailed Navalny for almost 5 years before the poisoning. They were always at his heels whenever he went to a campaign trip around Russia, or even on a vacation trip with his wife. They picked only times that he traveled with an overnight stay over, so they never followed him on day trips, which suggests they might have been interested only in hotel stays as a possible place of poisoning. And we noticed that these were not just regular FSB people, and that was the crucial finding. They were not only political police, as one unit of the FSB is called colloquially. There were some political police people, but on every single trip, there was also a team of a chemist and a doctor. A chemist with expertise in chemical weapons, and a doctor also with expertise in treatment of chemical weapons or use of chemical weapons. So this is a picture that got developed in front of our eyes, a team that had traveled with Navalny, alongside Navalny, without him knowing, on more than 35 trips over the last 5 years. And we placed these same people near the location of his hotel in Tomsk. A couple of days earlier, near the location of his hotel in Novosibirsk, where he was initially traveling to. And departing or moving away from the hotel about an hour after he went to bed on the night on which we suspect he was poisoned. So everything pointed to a targeted operation by an FSB clandestine unit. But that was only the first part we discovered. The second part was even more shocking. It was the scale of the operation of this particular unit. It was not an ad hoc operation to poison Navalny. It was an operation that apparently had been targeting many, many other not only opposition figures in Russia, but also human rights activists, journalists, and in one particular case that we are yet to disclose, an author, a writer, a poet. So the scale of this is still to be determined, but we see that we're talking about definitely more than 10 people that were at the crosshairs of this unit.
How were you able to identify these flights? What was your technique for learning this?
We used a combination of open source and partially closed source data. Over the years, we've accumulated a pretty significant database of, a collection of leaked databases of, for example, outdated travel data. For example, one database includes about 50% of all air travel in Russia from the period 2014-2017. Another database includes leaked passport data and residence data for a number of cities in Russia. So the combination of these to what we call open source sources, because they are in the public domain. You can download them on torrents, and a lot of Russian journalists have done that, allows us to look for patterns. So, for example, in this particular case, we had identified some people who had traveled with Navalny at every single trip that he took across the country. And that allowed us, through correlation analysis, to pinpoint about 6 people that were suspiciously always traveling with him. Many of them traveled on joint bookings, which allowed us to connect them to one another. That gave us the first hypothesis that there's this team of people who always tail Navalny. Then we had to cross into closed sources data. For that, we had to approach whistleblowers, in some cases, even people who are just selling data on the open market in Russia. There are a lot of data brokers in Russia that traditionally sell data, not to journalists, and they're quite unhappy when they find out they sold it to journalists, but they sell it to companies who do surveillance on their own employees in Russia, or are doing due diligence checks on applicants for jobs. And we got from some of these whistleblowers and or data sources, data brokers, we got phone records, what in Russia they call billing records, which is basically metadata on a particular number, time of call, place of location of the phone, when the call was made. So we were able to get the phone records for these particular 6 people that later expanded to 8 as a total. And we saw that they were communicating with top FSB officials just before the trips with Navalny. And more importantly, they were talking to chemical weapons specialists from exactly the same institute that we had identified in the previous research just before trips with Navalny.
Was there any way to tie it to Putin directly in your research?
Well, I mean, what we saw was them communicating with people at the FSB directorate level. So these are people that would be deputy to Bortnikov. Bortnikov is the chief of the FSB. And we saw this team talking to deputies of Bortnikov. Bortnikov is in direct contact. He directly reports to Putin. The concept of Putin not being aware or having ordered this operation, but let's limit it to not having been aware, is zero. That we've talked to a lot of people that were formerly serving in Russian security services and now live abroad. They've all told us that there's no way that anybody at the FSB would be authorized to go near a chemical weapon without the approval of the FSO, the president's own personal security service, simply for the fact that this is too dangerous, because somebody who gets access to such a high-grade poison might just go crazy and start attacking even the president. So the president needs to be in the know anytime somebody at any security service uses chemical weapons.
Were you able to speak or interview Mr. Navalny? And he also himself was part of discovering who it was who had poisoned him. Is that right?
Well, not him himself. We tried to firewall him from the discovery process, but we invited members of his own investigation team, the people that do anti-corruption investigations in Russia. And one of the key investigators, Maria Pevchik, she joined us at the last stage of our investigation. We made sure that Alexey Navalny is only informed at the last moment. So basically a week before we published, we brought him into the picture, just because we didn't want his own perception to bias our investigation. But yes, we brought him in at the last moment. We did have to get data from him through his chief investigator about his own travel. So that's what he was sharing with us, but without really knowing until late in the process who exactly were his would-be poisoners.
Your investigative journalism is just incredible, but you're dealing with very serious topics. Do you have any fear for your life?
Obviously, and especially after we found out for ourselves that this FSB unit had been after Navalny, while Navalny was at the crosshairs of the propaganda campaign of the Kremlin. We thought the Kremlin is unlikely to go after somebody that they're at the same time bad-mouthing, because it would make it too obvious who went after them. In Navalny's case, they did both. And they've been the Russian government has been so vocal about accusing Bellingcat and me and my colleagues of being a mouthpiece of Western intelligence and of being spies and of being traitors and what have you, that we have to start getting concerned.
Due to the poisoning of Navalny, the U.S. government announced economic sanctions. The sanctions are directed against several top Russian officials. The U.S. also reiterated demands that the opposition leader be released. But no sanctions were specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or his inner circle. VOA White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara tells us more.
This penal colony about 100 kilometers east of Moscow is where outspoken Kremlin critic Alexey Navalny has been jailed since last month after surviving a poison attack last year. The Biden administration declassified intelligence showing that Moscow orchestrated the poisoning and announced sanctions on 14 Russian entities and 7 senior members of the Russian government.
Expansion of sanctions under the Chemical and Biological Weapons Control and Warfare Elimination Act, new export restrictions on items that could be used for biological agent and chemical production, and visa restrictions.
Press Secretary Jen Psaki repeated U.S. demands for Navalny's release. The opposition leader's arrest set off nationwide street protests in Russia last month. Navalny contends his jailing is politically motivated. The U.S. sanctions were coordinated with European partners and Britain, but not specifically directed at President Vladimir Putin or the oligarchs of his inner circle.
Russia is a huge country. It has a lot of ways to influence the events in many parts of the world. So I understand that the only thing that Biden's administration could do is to send signals. These are strong signals, but these are just signals. This is not something that has a material effect.
The White House denies the sanctions are largely symbolic. Responding to VOA, Psaki acknowledged it is important to maintain relations with Moscow on many issues, including on the Iran nuclear negotiation.
Russia is a P5+1 partner. They were as we pursued the JCPOA under the Obama-Biden administration, and they certainly would be a key partner if that diplomatic process were to move forward. So the point is, there are areas where we disagree. There are areas where there's significant challenge. There are also areas where we are going to work with the Russians, as we would with most global partners, when we need to take steps that are in the interest of the United States.
Last month, President Joe Biden said that unlike his predecessor, he has made clear to Putin that the U.S. will no longer tolerate Russian aggressive actions, including election interference, cyber attacks, and the poisoning of its citizens. But analysts say Biden's policy toward Russia must allow room for engagement in areas of mutual interest.
This includes arms control, a positive environmental and economic agenda in the Arctic, to some extent climate change, and a couple regional theaters where we both have troops, including in Syria. So there's a need to work with Russia on a range of issues, and I think the Biden administration will pursue both cooperation and try to reestablish clear lines of what they regard as appropriate norms of international behavior.
Meanwhile, Moscow has already vowed to retaliate against the sanctions. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
From economic sanctions to retaliation over Russia's recent suspected hacking of several U.S. government agencies, the international community is closely watching the Biden administration's next steps regarding U.S. Russia policy. Matthew Rojansky is the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. He is a leading analyst on U.S. Russia relations, and I asked him where that relationship is headed next.
Well, look, this is a challenged relationship. From the U.S. perspective, we've seen a tremendous amount of troubling behavior from the Russian side. I think most salient for most people is interfering in U.S. elections, a constant barrage of social media propaganda, other forms of interference, attempts to sort of exploit divisions that already exist in our country, create new ones, exacerbate them. A lot of false information being trafficked via both Russian state media and unofficial mouthpieces, and then hacking. We've seen a tremendous amount of hacking, as well as the kind of more far-flung foreign policy issues. Russian support for proxies who are making trouble in various spots around the world, be it Syria, Libya, or of course Ukraine.
There's been a lot of response from in Europe and the United States to the poisoning of Navalny. There have been sanctions that the Biden administration has imposed on many high-ranking officials in Russia, but not on Putin or his inner circle. Why not?
Well, I think there are a number of sanctions that target senior members of the Russian security service. When you mention that Putin himself is not under sanctions, that may not be the biggest threat. A far bigger threat would obviously be preventing the Russian state from borrowing any money on international markets. And the United States, together with its allies and partners, would have a significant capability to erode Russia's ability to finance the Russian state.
We're less than 100 days into a new presidential administration, President Biden. We've just completed 4 years with President Trump. Is there a difference so far, and it may be too early for the Biden administration to have sort of a policy with Russia, but is there a difference in how the two administrations are dealing with, or did deal with, Russia?
Well, at the outset, there's a significant difference in tone, message, and in setting expectations. Recall that, President Trump's message from day one was he wants to fix the relationship. He wants to get along with Russia. He likes and respects Vladimir Putin. He sought these one-on-one meetings with Putin. And President Biden has said, if anything, the opposite, right? He said, he's clear-eyed and realistic. He has talked about the threat from Russia. He's talked about important business that needs to get done. And in fact, he's gotten that done by pursuing a 5-year extension of the New START Strategic Nuclear Arms Treaty. And within 1 week of taking office, President Biden called President Putin. They both orally agreed to extend the deal, and they followed up immediately with the paperwork and the legislative steps required to do it. So, on balance, as you say, less than 100 days into the administration, the rhetoric seems to be a lot more realistic given Russia's actual behavior and the state of the relationship. None of the kind of highfalutin expectations of resets or, a good personal rapport between the two leaders. But in terms of deliverables, it's impressive that the administration has actually extended the New START treaty.
So where is the U.S.-Russia relationship headed, if you can look into a crystal ball?
Well, look, the message from the Russian side is this is a spoiled relationship. You can't spoil an already spoiled relationship. So in that sense, it's almost like a rock bottom kind of message. You can only go up from here. Maybe that's cockeyed optimism. The message from Washington, though, I think kind of reinforces that by saying, look, we're not going to set unrealistically high expectations. We're not going to become friends. We're not going to become partners. If you follow that line forward, you could imagine the relationship on balance being in a better place 4 years from now than it is today.
That's all the time we have. Thanks to my guests, Matthew Rojansky and Christo Grozev. Stay up to date with the latest news at voanews.com and follow me on Twitter @Greta. Thank you for being plugged in.